Teruko Tawaki has a heavy burden to bear as the main character due to spare time. She has the most screen time, she's the most important narratively, and she's the focus of the story. A lot of the pressure is on her, and she's the one whose actions and character will define most of the plot. While this is true of many protagonists, Teruko's arc not only holds a significance from a duelist perspective, but also from a Watsonian perspective. It is this textual and metatextual commentary on her archetype that differentiates her from the other characters that fulfill her role, as well as her intrinsic ties to the themes and motifs of the narrative. Throughout DRDT, we see her development as a character and as a person, as well as her struggles with narrative pressure in the universe. Hi, I'm Winter, and in this video I'm going to be doing a character study of Teruko Tawaki. As the first named character to be introduced, Teruko sets the tone for the rest of the cast. Her dynamics with the other characters are going to be our first impressions of them, and thus it is critical for her characterization to be strong. As the protagonist of a story that is partially comedic in nature, Teruko makes for a good scene partner for the other characters by acting as their comedic foil. Due to being paired with many over-the-top and eccentric people, having a protagonist who is more down-to-earth and reasonable about things allows conversations to stay grounded. In many ways, she also serves as an audience surrogate, asking questions about the characters and universe in such a way that we as the audience can learn alongside her. To avoid these scenes feeling unnecessary, boring, or unnatural to the viewer, this trait also plays into a larger comedic bit with her character. Her lack of worldliness is played up for comedic effect, letting her fulfill a comedic and narrative role at the same time. Moving away from simply inspecting her role in the group dynamic, we also more generally learn that Teruko is a very blunt, to the point person, and that, while generally friendly, she can sometimes come off as slightly cynical, a trait that will come to the forefront later in the story. She's also somewhat sheepish at times, but a fairly confident person who has a habit of teasing others. She often misses information that other characters, most notably Charles, immediately pick up on, but she is just as often the most reasonable person in any given duo, as she has more common sense than most of her peers. Her main defining dynamics in the prologue and early chapter 1 are with Xander and Charles respectively, each of whom she plays off quite differently. Xander's dynamic with her is more generally friendly, so while she disagrees with him, her teasing generally comes across as lighthearted, and he doesn't seem to take that much serious offense to anything she says. Xander is the emotional core of the duo in that he has a much stronger moral compass and has a habit of reacting very emotionally and aggressively, which Teruko contrasts by being much more relaxed and more persistent to her classmates' attempts to provoke her. Xander also seems more invested in the situation and the people around him in general, while Teruko does not immediately bond with a lot of the cast in the same way he does. This level of distance is a part of her character that becomes much more obvious and important later in the story. Teruko's dynamic with Charles is more back and forth. While not necessarily enemies, so to speak, they both clearly have a distaste for each other, and this leads to a tonal shift from her dynamic with Xander. Unlike Xander, Charles is outwardly apathetic at best towards the rest of the group, making it painfully obvious that he does not put much value in the morality or feelings of others. While Teruko isn't as emotional as Xander, it's still clear that she stands above Charles in this regard, and thinks that he underestimates his own investment in his peers, a trait that she herself will later exhibit. A key point of their dynamic is the information gap between the two of them. Charles is clearly more academically minded, with his focus mostly being on his work and his talent. He's very knowledgeable in terms of science, technology, and the like, but he very clearly lacks life experience. Teruko, on the other hand, while not as quick on the uptake in an intellectual sense, clearly knows more about how the world actually works, as well as basic human nature. The two of them go through a back and forth in which they almost take turns being smarter than the other, making this difference in knowledge very apparent. Charles chides Teruko for not knowing what he considers to be basic info and noticing the things that he does. Teruko points out that Charles lacks common sense in regards to the social dynamic of the situation and the interpersonal relationships involved, and that he hasn't emotionally matured and clearly doesn't know much about people in general, much less himself. It's through these interactions that we get our initial read on Teruko's character. She's blunt, not afraid to say what she thinks, and while she may not know everything, she has a good understanding of the situation and is more reasonable than a lot of her peers. But this is just the starting point in terms of her characterization. The biggest and most apparent shift in Teruko's character arc occurs in, obviously, episode 6 of chapter 1. Her developments here mark the turning point of her arc and her major dynamics, as they serve to set her apart from the rest of the cast. In many ways, this is the beginning of her isolation as a character, and that leads to a new perspective on Teruko for us as the audience. Teruko has undoubtedly been in life-threatening situations before. The difference here is that it came from someone she trusted. While his motives are unknown, Teruko's immediate reaction is complete apathy towards him. When Min suggests that she might feel hurt by his betrayal, she mocks the idea. She convinces herself that she doesn't have nuanced feelings about his actions, even though it's shown later that she does feel guilty for his fate. In a sense, her outward placing of the blame on Xander is mainly a coping method she uses to assuage her own feelings of shame for letting this happen not only to herself, but to him. Teruko is not close to anyone in her life. Her closest friend is Xander, and not only did he betray her, but he's also dead. While she claims not to care, that's simply a mask. She thinks it's her fault that the people around her get hurt, so she pushes everyone away in an attempt to protect them from her, while attributing it to distrust and caution, when, in reality, it's her own luck, and on a deeper level, herself, that she doesn't trust. Min's accidental murder is not fully attributable to Min herself. While she played a role in it, most of the incident occurred simply due to being in the wrong place at the wrong time. In other words, pure luck. It is for this reason that Teruko feels personally responsible for her death, as she believes that the unlucky nature of the situation is completely due to her involvement in it. So when Min tries to connect with Teruko shortly before her execution, Teruko pushes her away, trying to provoke her in the moment before her death in hopes of masking her grief with anger. She knows Min is doomed. That's how her life works. The only thing she can do is keep her distance, not only for her sake, but for Min's as well. From her perspective, she only ever hurts those close to her. She doesn't want to care when that happens, and she doesn't want to have any responsibility for it. This is what sends her into her Chapter 2 spiral. While consciously she justifies it to herself as being reasonably precautious, it's painfully obvious that that isn't the real reason that she puts herself in this position. That, despite her claims otherwise, she blames herself. She paints herself as a victim to avoid feeling like the perpetrator, when the reality of the situation is much more nuanced than that. It is this duality of her characterization that drives her arc forward in Chapter 2. Chapter 2 quickly establishes a new status quo in terms of the group dynamic, illustrated best by their decision to open with the scene with Eden. Teruko has become distant from the rest of the group. She's the last character to make an appearance in this chapter, despite being the protagonist. This is only furthered by her general attitude towards the rest of the cast when she does appear. In Chapter 2, Episode 1, we learn a lot more about Teruko's general worldview that accompanies her luck, and how her interactions with Xander have affected that. While I'll go more in depth on this topic later, the key takeaway is that DRDT, and other pieces of media of the same genre, is, at its core, a tragedy, and Teruko is aware of this. This heavily influences her perception of the group dynamic and of herself, as she thinks that her mere presence as the protagonist of a tragedy will itself beget such a tragedy, not only for her, but for the entire group. Throughout the chapter, we are consistently reminded of Teruko's distrust of the group. This is best illustrated in various dynamics throughout the chapter, namely her dynamics with Charles, David, and Eden, each of which I will analyze later in their own sections. Except David, he gets his own essay. But do not misinterpret this. Teruko does not actually hold any disdain towards most of the cast, or at least not as much as one might believe upon first glance. Rather, her cold and standoffish behavior towards them is a manifestation of her own internalized guilt.
Charles! No, everyone here. We might act callously, but we're all only human. We're all real people with our individual emotions and weaknesses. You included, Teruko. Just like Charles. Even if you're acting cold, there's still a part of you that's good.
You want to talk about how great you think Charles is now, that's fine, go ahead. But if you start talking about me and saying that I could be a good person if only I make an attempt to change, then I'm gonna stop you right there. Don't say that I could be a good person, because all it'll do is make me feel bad that I'm not. I'll think about talking to Charles. Goodbye.
This exchange is a perfect example of her true opinion on the group. She actually feels extremely guilty, and considers herself a bad person. She simply copes by placing the blame on fate or on those around her, telling herself that it's not her choice whether or not she's a good person. That not only is she the protagonist of the story, but she's also the victim. However, this narrative does not go unchallenged. Teruko's first and most obvious parallel is Charles, due to essentially experiencing the inverse of his character arc. Their reactions to the events of Chapter 1 take them in completely different directions, to the point where their dynamic has completely flipped by Chapter 2. While he starts as her main rival character, Charles ends up as her main support, and this is critical in how it highlights aspects of both of their personalities. Teruko comes with her experiences with Xander by attempting to absolve her guilt via distancing herself from others. She justifies her aggressive and cold treatment of her peers by telling herself that it is simply inevitable, and that it's not her fault that she's reacting the way she is, because who wouldn't? Who wouldn't go off the deep end after something like that? Charles is the character who emphasizes to her that she does have a decision as to how she acts, and that she's being completely unreasonable. Despite outwardly considering herself the main victim of the case, it's important to remember Charles' involvement as well. While you could argue practically indefinitely about which one of them suffered more from Xander's manipulation, what actually matters is that they were both completely used by him as a means to an unknown end. And that drastically altered their worldviews, for better and for worse. Charles has proved that Teruko's worldview is false. Bad things happening to someone does not necessitate treating others poorly, nor does it justify one's actions. While this will be explored more in depth when I analyze him specifically, Charles displays the level of agency that Teruko thinks she lacks. He takes what happens to him in Chapter 1 and uses it as a reason to become a better, more reasonable person. Throughout Chapter 2, Teruko brushes off his appeals to her previous mindset. In a sense, both of them see the other as a past version of themselves. Teruko, Charles is a naive or more dangerously optimistic version of herself. To Charles, Teruko is the version of him that expresses all of his self-hatred and trauma as outward aggression, never introspecting or genuinely considering the feelings of those around him. This is what colors their interaction in Episode 3, their mutual sense of respect, but also their mutual sense of self-pity. Before the second Charles starts, Charles tells Teruko that her methodology is unsound, and that she's going to have to rely on other members of this group if she wants to succeed. She disagrees with him in that moment, telling him that he's being unreasonable, but it's clear that his attempt to change her worldview does not go unnoticed, because the trial that follows emphasizes her reluctant reliance on the rest of the group and her development since Chapter 1. While Charles demonstrates the inverse of Teruko's character development, Eden serves as her narrative antithesis. She parallels her not so much by similarity, so much as by pure contradiction. It is through their contrasting actions and reactions throughout the series that DRDT establishes its key themes. Teruko starts Chapter 2 with a very pessimistic outlook, one that is immediately and constantly challenged by Eden. Despite Teruko's attempts to distance herself from the rest of the cast to avoid hurting the people she cares about, Eden consistently goes out of her way to interact with her. When Teruko tells her that she needs her to let her cut herself off from the rest of the group, calling her naive for thinking that there's any possibility of a friendship between them, Eden says this. Teruko knows Eden isn't trying to manipulate her. She recognizes that Eden isn't connecting with her to take advantage of her or to get on her good side, but simply because she thinks it's the right decision. Eden has been on her side since the beginning. She's the only one to defend her in the first trial. She has absolutely no reason to believe that Eden would reach out to her, if not for generally kind-hearted reasons. And that conflicts with her outward justification for her behavior. Despite Eden ostensibly being trustworthy, in fact perhaps due to her trustworthiness, Teruko only distances herself from Eden further, becoming as cold and apathetic towards her as possible in hopes of getting her to let up. This cognitive dissonance is what later spurs her on to rethink this worldview. When she makes the decision to trust in Eden's innocence in the second trial and is proven correct, her entire perspective flips, and she's forced to think on what her actual motives are behind her actions. Teruko, on some level, knows that Eden, as well as many other members of the cast, has no intention of betraying her, despite the fact that she has been using that possibility as a means of explanation for her paranoia. Teruko lives off the concept that when given the opportunity, not only will those around her hurt her, but the universe itself will bend over backwards to beat her down. This fact is proven to her not only by Eden's innocence, but also by Levi's decision to sacrifice his life for hers. This is the turning point in which she finally reconsiders her own role in the narrative, not merely as a victim of circumstance, but also as her own independent person who is responsible for her actions. Determinism is a philosophical viewpoint predicated on the concept that all events are predetermined, either by natural, physical, and chemical realities, which is nominological determinism, or by some higher force as destiny, fatalism. Teruko exhibits a form of fatalism defined not only by the idea that the universe is dictated by the will of fate, but also by her belief that destiny is inherently weighed against her. More specifically, Teruko demonstrates aspects of narrative determinism, the concept that the real world functions like a narrative, with a main character and a cohesive plot, although it is more typically applied to historical interpretation. This is, of course, most clearly exemplified by her speech at the beginning of Chapter 2. Because of this, Teruko's in-universe justifications, not only for the events of the series, but for her own actions, are dualist in nature. Teruko's sense of fate seems to be intrinsically linked to her concept of a narrative, and to the notion that the universe functions in a narratively cohesive structure, in her case, the structure of a tragedy. Tragedies are often characterized not only by their obvious association with a shift to negative circumstance, but also by the force that causes the circumstance, being a key flaw of the protagonist. In other words, the hero suffers because of a tragic trait they possess. In Teruko's case, this is her luck. This causes her a sort of feedback loop of guilt. Bad things happen to her because of her luck, which is justified by her bad luck's negative effects on others. Teruko has no control over her life from her point of view, but she's also completely responsible for everything. Terrible things will happen to her and those she cares about completely independently of which actions she takes, and yet she will feel guilty for it. The best thing she can do is to detach herself from the consequences. She convinces herself that if she garners only hate for herself and those around her, she won't have to feel any pain when bad things come up for luck. She doesn't need to care about anyone else, and no one needs to care about her. If she lives like that, she thinks, maybe she can assuage herself of some of her guilt. The reason why Levi's sacrifice in Chapter 2 is such an important turning point is that it is the final piece of proof to Teruko that she's wrong. This is a point that is emphasized to her throughout the chapter, but it is in this scene that it fully sinks in. Distancing herself from the group and convincing herself that there's something to be done won't do her any good. Even though she goes out of her way to avoid the rest of the group, they still stick their necks out for her, and she still cares when bad things happen to them. As the rest of the group leaves, Teruko begins to question whether or not she was bred to conclude that she has no control over her circumstance.
Fate? Can you really say it's fate's fault for everything you've done, and pretend that you hold no blame in the matter? I have always said that my misfortune, my personality, the choices I make, everything was all a product of a bad luck that I can't control. That I grew up in such terrible circumstances. So I was destined to grow up to be a terrible person. That everyone else abandoned me. So it's not my fault that I'm alone. I want to say that it's fate's fault. And that I had no choice in the matter, but even so. Everyone. Xander, Min, Ari, Ace, maybe even Levi. Is it my fault that they died?
Teruko confronts her internalized guilt head-on, finally beginning to face what she's repressed for the entire story. It is through the actions of the characters around her that she introspects, and her true self-image is laid bare for the audience to see. The key reason why Teruko works as a protagonist is not only that she develops throughout the story, but that she's inextricably linked with the events of the story, and the characters around her. She's not a spectator undergoing an arc separate from the rest of the plot. Her development is intrinsically tied to every other member of the cast, and more importantly, to the nebulous concept of the narrative itself. Teruko makes a perfect central character, setting up important themes and arcs for the rest of the cast, and developing alongside and in response to the story. Thank you so much for watching. This is my first video essay, so obviously the quality isn't the best, and while I put a lot of effort into my writing, I'm not sure that it's my best work. I always struggle with formatting and clearly telegraphing my points. I also apologize for the potential difficulty in understanding what I'm saying. I'm autistic and I have a lot of trouble with intonation, enunciation, and speed when it comes to speaking. I'll be providing a transcript in the pinned comment as soon as I can so that it's easier to comprehend. Still, I hope you all enjoyed hearing my perspective on Teruko as a character and as a person. She's one of my favorites in the spare time, so I hope that I at least did her some justice. Expect more analysis for other members of the cast. Currently, I have my eyes on Xander and Charles, mostly due to their direct narrative connection to Teruko. Thanks and have a nice day.